Ben, how are you this afternoon?
I am fantastic, man. Good to be with you. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. I've followed your stuff on LinkedIn for a while, and you got an interesting story. You were
Mm,
practicing attorney. Now you're like chief growth officer at Nexel. Why don't you
hmm
introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to today.
Oh man, where do I begin? So before I get there, I before I went to law school, like you mentioned, I practiced for a while. Now I'm working in legal tech, which is kind of like my second gig in my 30s. I sort of went from practicing in my 20s to to into tech into my 30s, and I just turned 40. So let's see what I do now. It seems to be a 10 year spin. But before any of that, I'm happy to kind of give my background as a story. But I always like to say before all of that, I studied biology in college, and basically I took a bunch of neuroscience classes, and basically I forgot everything. Obviously, sorry, mom and dad, you know what I mean. But basically, I remembered one thing, which is the power of story, and how much our brain is actually wired for story. And I bring this up because I hope that it's like, we're going to be speaking to a lot of legal tech people. I've been in this game for a while, and we're sort of in this time between worlds and legal. And I think that the importance of telling good stories about not only where have we been, but where are we going is kind of so critically important. And I just kind of see like a lot of people in our space just thinking about this. So I'll tell my story really quickly. It goes something like this. After undergrad, I decided to get in law school. I went to law school not because I had some burning desire. It was mostly like because I didn't know what else to do, and really I was looking for a profession that was prestigious. Because at the time, I think I was looking for something that I could throw myself into that was performance based, prestigious. And which I thought that that would give me, at least professionally, some sort of degree of security. Through some therapy and thinking about other things, I realized that what I was trying to sort of do is I was trying to look for a place that I thought would keep me safe. Now, there's a whole lot to unpack there, but basically, by the time I hit 30, I realized that neither was I sort of feeling a degree of safety, but actually it ended up being a bad fit for me, right? So I was sort of thrown into something that I thought was going to do something for me, and it ended up being a really bad fit for me. Specifically, whenever it came to kind of something that I thought was unique about me, which was the ability to sort of like be creative, think outside the box, kind of like kind of chase things. Maybe we would call this entrepreneurship now. We would call it creativity in some sense, to sort of develop new and innovative ways of looking at things. And that really just didn't jive with the innovation, with the precedent based, partner based track of what law firms were at that point in time. So I I I can get in. I get into this all the time in my this legal life, but basically, we were doing this product liability case, and we brought in this e-discovery vendor who had early artificial intelligence, and and a light bulb went off, right? Which was, wow, this is sort of like interesting technology applied to the practice of law. This is 2015, so of course there had been practice stuff, but this was the first thing that I saw like that was like a 10x difference. And specifically because I had been doing all the discovery and all of this kind of stuff, I sort of saw and I was like, my God, this thing just did in 6 hours what I couldn't do in 6 months. This is like a 10x difference. It's not that, oh, wow, great, it's a database with stuff on it. It was like a 10x difference in terms of the output of what was able to do. That was to me the writing on the wall. So I fell off my horse, and by that I mean that's a metaphor to basically say I packed my bags, told my parents I wasn't going to practice law anymore, moved up to New York, and this is a much longer story, but eventually, through the twists and turns of taking a lot of risks, burning a bunch of money, getting down to my last paycheck, I managed somehow, some way to get into legal tech and eventually become part of the founding team at Nexel, where I am right now. And it's just been a lot sort of from there right now, and that's the abridged version, but we can go into some other stuff for a bit.
Good stuff. So and so you're a podcast host yourself, and it's this legal life. And what's the premise? Who's your target audience? What sort of topics do you
Yeah.
discuss?
Yeah. So basically, the big why behind the whole podcast is whenever I graduated from law school, I basically had zero kind of guidance in terms of how to develop a career that I thought was going to be good for me and develop sort of like an intentional career as a lawyer. I was basically given like three pieces of advice: go work for a company, go work for the government, or go work for a law firm. And that was basically it. Period. And that was okay, but there wasn't anything else beyond that, effectively. Whenever I left to get into tech, there was no guidance whatsoever. Obviously, I just kind of like you just sort of go into the wilderness and get into the maze. My big why behind starting this is it's an interviewed podcast where I ask people how they built their careers, and I ask specifically for them to tell it in a story sort of format. And my hope is that when people hear, how did I become a managing partner? How did I become a practice group leader? How did I jump from tech into consulting? How did I jump from a lawyer into tech? How did I get into within tech? How did I start a company? How did I scale a company? How did I get there? It's less about the specifics, and it's more about kind of humanizing these people in their sort of fixed roles and saying everybody starts from basically zero, and everybody usually starts from a place of sort of fear and kind of builds it up as they go. That's really the point. And hopefully, with all of this together, sort of building a corpus of what's it like to build a legal career today? What does it take, really?
Interesting. And you on our last and during our last conversation, you were really talking about how you advocate for the business of law being on equal footing with the practice of law. Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, personally, where this insight has come from is that after I left the practice of law, I quickly, even to make it, I started to develop all of my business skills to kind of complement all of these practice of law skills. Now, I wasn't working. I wasn't working in a law firm specifically that point in time. But what I kind of realized is that I sort of by opening my skill set up to practice management, operations, understanding marketing, sales, understanding what growth is, understanding pricing, packaging, metrics, all the rest of it, really sort of supporting all of these practice skills. What I had noticed, and I even tried to run my own firm and put out all of this kind of stuff, and all of it, what it all came back to was freedom and high agency came from effectively being able to run a practice like a business, being able to set goals, being able to back those goals out with specific metrics, being more data driven. It was just this whole world that in my 20s trying to practice, I never really had an understanding of it. And so what I'm ultimately getting at is that today, at an individual level, what really I think distinguishes most lawyers is the ability to sort of run their practice as a business, and those skills really give them a competitive advantage in a very, very competitive market. And we can go into laterals and all of this, but I think you're probably getting what I'm getting at. Okay, then abstract that one or aggregate that up to the law firm. And today, what you sort of start to see, and I know we'll get into this, is well, is technology driving some sort of parity whenever it comes to the actual practice of law? And then does that mean that the business of law is ultimately the end differentiator as it relates to both the client experience or or both, sort of how these practices grow and are able to generate new clients, keep those clients, scale those clients, expand those clients? Obviously, it's two sides of the same coin in terms of the product that you're offering, but there's just what I'm just saying is, yes, it's the practice, and everybody will tell you you need to have the basis of practice. What I'm looking for is, and what I'm seeing is the differentiating factor where there is a delta is basically in the business of law. And I think that of course, this sort of pats our own back in terms of what we're doing at Nexel and all of it, but it doesn't. It still remains true that I think relationships, and specifically the idea of engaging relationships in the context of sort of thinking about it from a practice and how to grow, is honestly where the interesting innovation ultimately lies.
Yeah, and you had mentioned when we spoke last about how the typical lawyer mindset is plan then act, and
Yeah.
in the entrepreneurial world, it's act then gain
Right.
clarity,
Right.
right? And
Yes.
that
Right.
and
Act
that's
and scale, maybe something like this. Yeah. Right.
so one of our core values at Infodash, and we actually really use our core values. They don't just sit up on a dusty, frame on the wall. Like, we use them
Mm,
actively. One of them is called Simplify and Go.
yeah.
And
Right.
one of the challenges that I have seen, I would assume this probably happens in the legal world too, is
Sure.
we'll get technical guys who are masters. They are
Sure.
violin makers.
Yeah.
And
Right. Right.
sometimes you just need a doghouse. And getting a
Yeah.
violin
Mm,
maker to build a doghouse is a really
sure.
hard thing to do, but it is 100% necessary. And that's why we
Yeah.
talk about Simplify and Go. Then there's a
Mm,
bunch of sub bullets under that, but the most
sure.
memorable one is take a bias towards action, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's act and then figure it out, iterate. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Mm,
So
yeah.
what did you have to make a shift from the
Sure. Of course. Yes.
what
Right.
did
Right.
that
Right.
transition look like?
I mean, it's so let me, I do this podcast, and it's called This Legal Life, and basically I ask everybody the same series of questions, which is questions about putting their facts in the context of a story, specifically the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey, if you've ever seen a Marvel movie, if you've seen any movie about transformation, it's all the same story over and over and over and over and over again. It's a very famous story. This guy called it the monomyth, which is it's the myth on which every other myth is sort of built on. And basically the whole thing is just a big metaphor of you used to think a certain way, then you went through an experience, and now you see it in another way. You see the world in another way. In my case, in my old life, I was really always trying to plan for things, plan, because in some sense, I was looking for safety, I was looking for security, I was looking for some sort of degree of control, let's say, from the environment. So I was planning, always gathering. And in that sense, yeah, that serves you really well, I think, in a precedent-based system. But as soon as I left there to sort of hear the calling of creativity, hear the calling of entrepreneurship, hear really my grandfather's voice, because my grandfather was a pretty successful entrepreneur in South America. Um, Once I got in there, I basically realized that that skill set was underserving me. So I had to flip the entire thing. So instead of planning and then acting, I had to act and then sort of get clarity from it. And that's what I inevitably learned, to be able to do this. I mean, I had to basically, I was burning my money, and I was down to my last like rent check. Whenever all of a sudden, and I was just trying so many things, right? And it was just like every single time the bank account was going more and more and more and more, I got more desperate to do more and more and more and more things. And eventually, just so happened that I got a call from Legal Sifter from some flyer that, I gave out. And here's to put a super fine point on it. I gave a flyer about something about sort of like legal experience. At that point in time, I was sort of trying to be like a GC for legal tech startups. That was my quote unquote interesting plan to get into tech. And so they call me and they're like, yeah, we don't want the general counsel service, but we have an opening in sales. Do you want to come and like be a salesperson, like bottom of the floor salesperson, and just sort of like work your way sort of up? So this is the point, the best laid plans of mice and men typically go afoul. And in that case, that was my acting, but my acting ended up opening up another door that it wasn't even related to. So in some sense, you just have to sort of trust in that capacity, and we can get much farther out in terms of acting and what that does. But anyway, I think you probably sort of get it.
Yeah, I mean, I took a lot of interesting turns in myself. So I did not do well in high school, and my mom put me to work in her restaurant, gave me the crappiest jobs humanly possible, and I like begged to go back to school. And I went to community
Yeah.
college for a couple of years, was on the dean's list the
Mm.
entire time. I ended up getting into University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, out of state, which is actually hard to do.
Mm.
Ended up getting studying actuarial science to be an actuary.
Yeah.
And then I started applying for internships, and you basically had to have like a 3.7, and I didn't.
Mm.
I was working my way through school, and I was a good
Mm.
student by that point. I had turned it around, but I didn't have a 3.7. So I ended up pivoting and just getting a general math degree. I started a business part-time, a
Mm.
collection agency, and
Yeah.
my mom was getting bombarded with bad checks, gave them to me to collect, build a business,
Right.
started it. Um, and I learned the skills of entrepreneurship. And then I went on, I also acquired so much tech skills, and this is in the late 90s, mid to late
Interesting.
90s,
Yeah.
that ended up going to work for Microsoft.
Yeah.
And
I
then
saw that. Yeah.
and then I started consulting on the side, and then side gigs
Mm.
started making more than the day job. And it's like,
Yes.
your story is not an unusual one. If I started off as basically high school dropout, going nowhere, then going to one of the best public universities and majoring in math, then owning a collection agency, then working
Yeah.
for
Right. Right.
Microsoft, and now I'm like a
Yeah.
legal tech guy. So,
Yeah. That's right. I
it's
know. I
like,
know.
I think there are a lot of stories out there that have a lot of twists and turns that, if you would have told me that I'd be here where I am today 30 years ago,
Yeah.
I would have
Right.
laughed.
Yeah. And the point of that story, and by the way, your story resonates so much, as part of this legal life, I ask everybody the same questions. And what's amazing is that, this insight about acting first and then sort of gaining clarity is so, 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 so powerful once you sort of step into the new world. Everybody does this. And in some sense, I don't want to get so big out there, but like, in some sense, life sort of forces you in a way to sort of like do that. But the point is like it's just hard to appreciate how much the twist and turn of sort of like the road uh, opens up. But first, you got to sort of like trust. You kind of got to like act, and then it'll meet you sort of like halfway, sort of thing. And in some sense, it's just not enough to plan, in this way. So that's to me, that's like the big takeaway of sort of of all of these interviews that I've done in this legal life. I ask everybody the same question, and nobody's life is the same, and yet everybody goes through the same exact thing. So it's like this sort of weird paradox. Every single person is on the same script, but no script is exactly the same. No movie is exactly the same, effectively.
Yeah. And well, and so your journey took you to Nexel, and
Mm.
Nexel is a CRM for legal. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's accurate. Right. We'd like to think of CRM plus. We're really taking the idea of CRM and we're kind of modernizing it for the modern law firm. So there's a lot to say in that, but it's CRM plus. Really, we do have an email marketing system, collaboration system, and yeah, the idea is it's not a back office CRM; it's a front office CRM that's used by the lawyers on a day-to-day basis.
Interesting. And so you have seen, and I have seen as well, the mess that is often law firm IT environments. I mean, even at the
Mm.
bigger levels, you've seen historically underinvestment. There's still a ton of on-prem infrastructure at law firms.
Sure.
There's a lot of legacy architecture. Legal tech has been, there's this dynamic where the big players in the space buy up the small innovative companies, and then they just go there and
Mm.
die. And
Yeah.
so there's not been a ton of innovation, but you know you have seen the challenges around data and lawyers'
Mm.
willingness to check documents in their DMS and profile them and put contacts in
Sure.
CRM. Like,
Yeah.
how do you motivate lawyers to do these things that are necessary to have a robust thing like a platform like a CRM?
Sure. So when we were thinking about the CRM and sort of building up the CRM and thinking about it from the ground up, we sort of knew, of course, the cultural gravity of data input as it sort of stood in 2020, which is right in Nexel's story. We had gone through a pivot in like everybody else's story. You try one thing and then you hit it down. You hit a wall, and then you try something else, and that gives you sort of a spark, but not the thing. So eventually, we land on a CRM in 2020. We're getting pulled by our clients to really sort of build this CRM. We had started as a referral management system, which is like a subset of CRM specifically for the referral partnership. And then we had things that we were doing on the back end of that. But then they just said, just build us a CRM because the ones that we have here, nobody's using, and it's just sitting there like a dead database. Anyway, in 2020, we were at a state with the technology that really allowed for two things. One, we were able to link up with the 365 system, and really monitor the data flows specifically across email and meeting. And then the second, which is the most important, is we've all been on the internet for a long time. Our internet's on our data is on that internet. This basically affords, and in 2020, the idea of enrichment, specifically data enrichment through APIs, was really at a point. So the innovation, of course, was taking those two things, the 365 platform that had been well integrated into law firms and the data flows within that, and then combining that with enrichment to basically do something like a passive data entry system for CRM that was then served up in what we would like to think of as a modern CRM basis built with the lawyer user in mind, not the back office database, but the lawyer use in mind. And I can go into what that looks like, but basically it's like you want them to use it, so it has to feel like your iPhone, in some form or fashion, because that's where that's where the bar is, and that's where sort of the gravitational use is right now in terms of software. So we took all of that together, and that's how we got over the initial idea of, wow, data is critical, but how do we get the data sort of necessarily in?
So, one thing you wrote about is, which I think it might have been my inspiration for reaching out to you, was like the law firm CRO. And
Yeah, of
I
course.
always chuckle when I think about a law firm CRO in big law specifically. I don't know if it would be any different. I just know big law well, so when I try and picture that role, I think about what a CRO does. Like a CRO,
Yeah.
maximizes revenue opportunities and client retention. Customer
Yep.
success is often a part of the chief revenue officer's
Sure.
remit. So when I think about, well, first of all, customer success doesn't exist. It doesn't exist.
Right.
I've never
Yeah,
seen
that's
it.
right.
Um,
Yeah, right.
but okay, so that doesn't exist. And then when I think about like some of the trade-offs that a chief revenue officer in big law would have to try and make and get buy-in for, like, hey, you know what? We're doing $5 million a year in business with Coca-Cola, but it's low margin, and we've got
Right.
Pepsi, an opportunity with an RFP for Pepsi. What if we exited that Coke relationship and pursued Pepsi? And I just laugh. I chuckle of the conversation with the partner that owns that. He's out the door.
Yeah.
He's gone.
Sure. Right.
He's not giving up
That's
his
right.
book of business. He's leaving. He's going down the street, and maybe that's okay. But God, it just seems like big law specifically, has such a hard time empowering the business of law leaders. It's it's a real challenge. So I don't know how would you see this CRO? Would it work in legal, in a big
Yeah.
law?
So, well, the answer is, for all the reasons that you stated, it's incredibly difficult. And yet I think that there is external forces that are sort of driving a little bit of this evolution. I don't know what it's going to be like, and I only use CRO because I work at a tech company, and CROs are very sort of like maximalized and leveraged in the context of sort of like sales organizations within tech companies. So I don't know what that's going to look like. I'd be surprised. I mean, there are CROs within law firms, but let me set something up. The way that, when we think about it at Nexel, and specifically the idea of revenue and growth, I would say in this capacity is, look, at the end of the day, step one is really sort of like the data infrastructure, because the data infrastructure starts to bring a degree of clarity and at the very least a degree of objectivity whenever it comes to your Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. Of course, law firms have traditionally run on the finances, but finances need to be attached to relationships. Relationships need to be attached to engagements. Engagements, and I mean engagements, yes, engagements in terms of clients, but it also needs engagements in terms of interactions over the course of period of time. Now, once you get data and you start plotting all of that together, then what you get is the idea of insights. And insights can be, to some lesser extent, to more or lesser extent, insights can start to drive the conversation. Now, if insights are back office BI sort of tools that never see the light of day and or are fundamentally based on bad data, it's never going to happen. But we think that, gee, we sort of figured out the data piece. Can we solve the insight piece? And whenever you stack all of those two things together, what you have real-time data insights tied and contextualized, and then brought to the fore with things like client insights. And what does that mean? I mean, being super practical, what that means is that the practice group leader on a Monday can have a data informed meeting based on real world insights that basically are also contextualized within the context of all the soft stuff. That to me is at least a better meeting that encourages questions around what's possible based on true evidence. And evidence is good, right? And evidence is good. And to me, somebody asked me one time, like, what's the best way to convince like lawyers to use tech? And it was like, you kind of have to like give it to them a little bit, and they have to use it. That means it has to be really good. But if you bring all of this together, insights that are in the hands of every partner, they're all sort of using it, and it's actually trusted, and the evidence is there. I think that at least starts to have an interesting conversation in terms of what are the trade-offs that we need to make. Now, you bring in the idea of politics, and you bring in the idea of culture, and you bring in the idea of precedent, and that is a difficult problem. Yes, it is. But, to me, then this gets into what are the driving forces that might be changing that story or changing the incentives. And we talked about it there, and I'll just lay it up, and then I want you to come back in on this. But it's like clients, if they say jump, law firms say how high. The margins and the technological revolution that is sort of happening in and of itself right now, and who even knows, and then the last is maybe some sort of like generational shift that's going on. So you bring in generational shift, you bring in client experience, and you bring in reduced margins. Does that lay enough of the incentives combined with the data and the insights and sort of the conversations to actually tee up the idea of not even chief revenue officers? Let's just talk about empowered business leaders making true big decisions, all the way down to being able to say not Coke, but Pepsi, sort of thing. I don't know. If I had a crystal ball, it'd be pretty interesting. But it just seems to me that even 10 years ago, this whole dynamic wasn't possible. So the question is, are we getting to a tipping point? That's the question, and tipping points are real. Tipping points happen all the time,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think there are some mindsets that really get in the way. So a big one for me that I have an issue with is that legal is a profession and not a business. And that's
Yeah.
baloney, man. That is baloney. I used to talk about it quite a bit. So every profession is a business, but not every business is a profession.
It's a profession.
Right,
Yeah, sure.
right.
Yeah.
And what
That's a good one. I'm going to
distinguishes
use that one. Yeah. Right.
what
Yeah.
distinguishes a profession from a business are the things that you would think of with legal. There's there is a standards organization, there are certifications and requirements and CLEs and ethical guidelines and those sorts of things. That starts to paint the picture of profession. But every profession is also a business,
Right.
because you still have to generate revenue and file your taxes and do sales
Yeah.
and marketing, all those things. But lawyers, like, there is an article out there. I'd encourage anyone who really wants to get a good laugh. The Florida Bar Association has a manifesto on the difference
Yeah.
between a profession and a business. And
And a
honestly,
business, right?
and I think it's a bunch of horse shit. I don't buy into it. Lawyers, you're not
Yeah.
special, right? You
Yeah.
do a very, you perform a very important function. It's no more
Mm.
important than a doctor, right? Where
Yeah.
people's lives are on the line, and what you do is important. I'm not saying that, but it's not. It doesn't elevate you above a what qualifies as a business. And I think that mindset starts to get in the way of lawyers and law firm leadership thinking about, like, how do we market effectively? How do we maximize revenue? How do we drive bottom line performance? Because those are business conversations.
Yes, right.
So I don't know, man. Do you see this business and profession
Yeah.
distinction getting in the way at all?
Yeah, of course. In some sense, whenever if I could expand that out, this is why I sort of believe so deeply in the idea of stories, because mindsets and beliefs are basically functions of worldviews, and worldviews are basically are basically stories built up together in some sort of cohesive sort of like function. And stories, what is a good story? Well, in some sense, I sort of told you, there are deep stories that are basically ingrained in our brains in terms of, I just told you one, right? That the hero's sort of like journey. One of them, I think, is the idea between profession and business. However, what you realize if you study stories, and if you study stories as like it sort of like goes through time, basically what you kind of realize, and this is a very big, bold claim, that stories basically get updated over time as technology sort of like changes. This is such a big topic. I'm such a nerd, but like basically the function of worldviews and stories, worldviews and technology, there is such a, I don't know if anybody's ever thought about this. If you're crazy like me and you think about these sorts of things, but just think about it. Basically, throughout human history, I'm about to do something that starts with throughout human history. Think about sort of farming leads to farming inevitably leads to sort of like city infrastructure inevitably leads to things like the industrial revolution leads to sort of like information technologies is now leading. Every single one of those things had a huge jump. And yes, we can go all the way back to fire. Fire as a sort of basis. All of these technologies had a huge societal sort of like shift, basically. And that societal shift allowed for the old stories to fundamentally change. So the open question is, are we have a new technology, something sort of happening? Is that enough to sort of like change worldviews at some point in time? That's really the question. But there is a correlation between technology and the stories that basically we tell, and sort of like the worldviews that basically get built up for that. That's why at the end of the day, it's like, yes, I work in tech, but what I ultimately think is interesting is the stories that end up sort of building up based on that sort of shift in tech, because it just changes like the possibility frame, basically, for what people can imagine effectively.
Yeah,
And it always has been.
And I have not brought that up. Longtime listeners have heard me preach from that soapbox before, but it's been a while.
Yeah.
And, I think AI, I have not, until you just really mentioned it, I had not really thought about AI's impact on that distinction between a profession and a business. It is going
Yes,
to
right.
really blast
That's right.
that out of the water, because as
Sure.
we move as the billable hour loses ground, and I don't think the billable hour is going away, but I do think it is going to lose a lot of ground very quickly.
Yeah.
As the billable hour loses ground and alternative fee arrangements start to gain momentum, they already exist, but they will become more and more prominent in legal pricing models. How
Yeah.
can you not have just real business conversations about, okay, if we implement these efficiencies, if we make this investment in technology, and we hire these resources to help us improve productivity and efficiency that will help drive bottom line performance. These conversations are going to be unavoidable, and I don't see how you could stand there and say, well, we're a profession, we're not a business. No, you're both. So
Yes,
that's a good point.
Yes.
I do think that AI is really going to have it's going to really blow that whole argument out of the water, I think.
There's a lot there. Yeah, totally. It's this is why I'm like very fond, and I was having a conversation with Tom Martin, and I'm very fond of this idea of we're in a time between worlds. And like I like test that out with people, and I'm like, oh, how does that intuitively feel like whenever I say that time between worlds? And to me, it makes a lot of sense because we know what we're leaving, but we haven't necessarily got to where we're sort of like at. And this always happens. The transition from being a Middle Ages King, Queens, Game of Thrones to basically something like the Renaissance, which eventually just led to basically the Industrial Revolution. That was like such a crazy time, like basically the whole thing kind of like collapsed to be reconstituted in something like Florence, Italy, and from there sort of like the idea of enlightenment sort of like spread from there. But that was such a crazy time, like between these things. If you go back and like read history, it's so insane, the way that like kind of spurred, and that's, to me, that's what it feels like right now. And we have this new sort of like technology.
Yeah, so there's a concept called liminality, and
yes, of course. Yeah, totally.
Liminal periods
the
are
liminal space.
right.
Is
that messy middle between
yes, right,
current state and future state, and that is exactly where we are. And anyone, including me, who pretends to know exactly what the future state's going to look like, we don't. We have a general kind of very blurry outline that we know things are going to be different. They're going to be very different.
Sure.
But we don't have it all figured out. So
yes.
Well, along those lines, with respect to AI, you and I talked a little bit about agents and agentic workflows, and how data and agents can lead to lawyers having the right conversations at the right time. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so this is like, to frame this conversation up, and to give some context, this is what I'm thinking about in terms of the law firm growth stack, basically, of which something like empowered business leaders are sort of like the last in that stack. So if I could just like sort of like name the stack, it would go like this. 1, you need to have data. 2nd, you need to have insights based on that data. 3rd, you need to have sort of tools that kind of like are used within the context either through people. 4th, you can start to, of course, have agentic workflows that are basically using tools, knowledge, and data, and of course a prompt, and I basically have just described the entire agentic sort of like system, but you can also see it as a stack within a firm. And then lastly, of course, let's say humans in the loop or business leaders in the loop or something like this, so it's like when you step back, that micro thing, which I just described, a prompt that goes to a knowledge base that uses data, that uses some tools to produce an output that then is like sort of checked. That's basically the agentic workflow. You would just take that and say, oh, that's sort of how a law firm would run if it was like growing and trying to grow as sort of like a stack, basically, effectively. So I'm really like, I like this idea a lot. I like how like sort of the macro sort of becomes a micro, but to put a fine point on it as it relates to right conversations at the right time and using that model that I just laid out, basically we see a future where agentic workflows can go all the way up to basically teeing up conversations for lawyers to have the right person at the right time with the right conversation based on, again, this is where we want to go. This is the highest value use of your time as it relates to client and business development, because, and I mean, I could go through so many different things. This client is on fire. This client opportunity has the opportunity to expand. This is a new market opportunity. We have a density with regards to a number of relationships within a certain account. You should try to engage that right now. I mean, there is a revenue potential there as it relates to X, Y, and Z. So all of these things But of course, trying to get there today based on the current stack of law firms, it stops before it even starts, because it's simply too, from that thing, just the prompt. The prompt is the right question. The prompt to the data, to the tooling, to the knowledge base and insight, all the way to until it gets to the bottom, which is the lawyer in the loop, or let's say the output that needs to happen. There's just still so much resistance in there. But today, I think what you're seeing with this agentic idea is the idea that all of this can kind of be aggregated all the way up to kind of having a CRO or sales conversation, sales coach conversation in a highly contextual way, where people are sort of like teeing up those conversations.
You know, we are looking at similar things in the business of law, and you know what, this is really kind of straddles the fence between business of law and practice of law. So we have a new extranet product, and our intranet product is already very well established. We've got like, I don't know, 30% of the AM law use it. But we just launched our extranet solution, and one of our first clients is a labor and employment firm, and they have all of this labor and employment data for all 50 states in this nice, neat SQL database that powers this portal where their clients pay them to come in and peruse the new regulatory updates in specific states. And we said, hey, rather than having your clients log in and peruse updates, what if you took that regulatory data? You've already got all their employment agreements, their employment contracts in your DMS, and you crawl and index that using like Azure AI Search. And then we take all that regulatory data and we look for exceptions, and we flag exceptions like, hey, non-competes in California are now outlawed. You've got 732 employment agreements, and that has to be remediated. And it allows the law firm to now be proactive, right? And tell clients, you're not coming to me telling me you have a problem. I'm coming to you telling you have a problem. And those are revenue opportunities. Those are ways lawyers can, log billable hours. They have to fix the documents. And it's very agentic. And I mean, from a technical perspective, Microsoft is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It's Azure AI Search, it's Azure OpenAI, and then we build workflows and Power Automate that get routed to the person who owns the relationship. And then the client can log into our extranet portal and see all the exceptions and where they are in the process. Is this remediated? Is this in process? Is this in the backlog? And man, it is game changing for this firm.
Totally.
And that is one of a bazillion stories where agentic AI can just completely change the model.
Yes, totally. And when I hear you, basically what I hear as the principled leverage point there is the prompt, from the perspective of, hey, why don't you put 2 and 2 together and see what that allows you to do? So it's the prompt, it's the original thing. We use the word prompt all the time now, but it's still the prompt for the entire workflow to sort of like start. But that prompt, thinking in that frame of mind is what affords for all of these workflows to still start to. It is not a technical problem. Sometimes it's a data problem. Almost never is it a tooling problem, because God, there's more tools than are possible out there. Knowledge base that can be built. Human in the loop. There's a bunch of, I know so many great business of law leaders who are in law firms today. Really, where we're stuck is this idea of prompt. And of course, this sort of relates back to what we were talking about. This relates back to worldview, because if your worldview doesn't include these sorts of prompts, then you're not going to get there, kind of thing.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And like, what about some of the other, I know we're almost out of time, but I really wanted to touch on this topic with you, was like the structural and cultural barriers that we see in law firms, that consensus, command and control, consensus driven decision making, and like how do we navigate around and do, like, I don't know your system, but it sounds like it's modern. You guys have thought through it. How do you overcome the cultural barriers where lawyers have a lone wolf mindset? They're off the charts, in terms of autonomy and critical thinking. And, there's a ton of lateral movement between lawyers at law firms, even at the partner level. Like, how do we how do you guys think about attacking that problem in order to really make a solution like yours maximize its value?
Two of the points that we brought up. So the first is bringing data and insights and making those easily of almost everybody's workflow is critically important. And that's why modern CRM plus modern insights need to be used across the entire firm so that everybody can come prepared with those insights. Now, that only gets you so far because now everybody has the information, everybody has sort of the evidence. But to me, it's like once you're having a conversation based on the same data around that meeting, then everybody can at least have that conversation on equal basis whenever it comes to information data. And that's a big jump already from the way that law firms are making decisions right now within the context of yes, of course, consensus and the partnership, but still, it's like, but there's also, of course, power dynamics, but underneath that and all the rest of it, data at least clears or at least levels the playing field whenever it comes to evidence and insights. And I think giving as many people that sort of access to that data at least allows for the conversation to be on the second foot. On the same foot. And the second part of that is there has to just basically be new stories whenever it comes to the worldview of what's possible. But if you believe what I'm saying, which is technology affords a new opening of the window, then you should try to tell new stories that basically include this new data, this new insights, this new everything that you've just heard us talk about as a realm of possibility today, and see if these two sorts of things allow at least for you to have a conversation that runs up inevitably against the idea of precedent. Now, it's just going to be a slow hog, at least at the beginning. But if you believe that having better data, a lot of people having conversations based on the same data, the collective intelligence of a bunch of smart people talking about that, and tools that are powered, if you believe that that firm is going to outcompete other firms, then at the end of the day, it's just going to be a matter of evolution. The strongest, fastest firm is inevitably going to win out, and then that's going to just basically be a signal to the rest of the market. I would just then say it's like there's that, and then there's a story of different client expectations and all the rest of it, and you bring all of these things together. So there's obviously no golden bullet that sort of changes all of this. I'm just arguing that it feels like we're at a tipping point right now with a lot of different things that are coming together at a lot of different places. But, it's still going to be a conversation. But I would say that the future belongs in this time between worlds. The future belongs to kind of like the storytellers who can tell a story that transcends and includes all of everything that's going on right now. It's not that precedent is bad, but it's not just precedent. It's not that law firms are not a profession, but it's also a business. And what does that look like? Those are just stories. Those are just big stories that form worldviews effectively.
It's a great point. That's so true. They're just stories. And the stories are changing, and it's an exciting time
always
to be here. Well, this has been a great conversation. Before we go, how do people find out more about your podcast or what you do at Nexel?
For sure. So follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot about sort of my own journey, my own career journey from practice into tech, and sort of the things that I've the mindsets that I've had to change and what I've learned. I'm still learning so much every single day. You can reach out to me about Nexel as well if you're interested in that case. And, if you are somebody who's kind of heard me and loves to tell their own career story, wants to in some ways inspire others based on where you're at, I'd love to have you on the podcast. Really, I love to hear stories about people who have gone from on the traditional beaten path to kind of like turning right, and what that inevitably taught them, both not only about the legal industry but about themselves. So definitely reach out to me if that resonates with you. And Ted, thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. It's been a blast. It's been a good time. I've really enjoyed it. And we'll include links in the show notes. So for those folks that are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, We also have a website, legalinnovationspotlight.com. It's got all the episodes. It's got show notes and links and all that sort of stuff. So we'll include your stuff in there, and hopefully people reach out and get in touch.
I love it. Thank you for making the space. Love what you do. It's a lot of fun. We are in such a time between worlds, and like, I know it's messy in there, but at the end of the day, it's also, there's a lot of promise, a lot of upside here, I think. So the future's bright.
Ton of opportunity. All right. Thanks so much for being on, Ben. All right.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much.
Take care. Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content.